Hello, I'm Joe Garcia, Vice President of Public Policy at Chicanos por la Causa, also Executive Director of Chicanos por la Causa Action Fund, which is the advocacy arm of CPLC. And right now, advocacy is important. There's a lot of things going on. We all heard about Proposition 314 here in Arizona. And then, of course, everywhere we're talking about the planned Trump mass deportations. What does that mean to our community? Well, what actions are we taking to deal with that, to cope with it, and to combat that, and to watch against abuses? Today, we have a panel of three esteemed attorneys who are going to help answer some of those questions. This is just a conversation to kind of see where we're at on all these issues, very key issues. So let me introduce our guest right away, and we'll get into the discussion. To my right is a colleague of mine, a great legal mind, uh, Marcos Tapia. He is legal counsel for Chicanos por la Causa. And to his right is Danny Ortega, a civil rights attorney in his own right, with also a civil rights leader with a great deal of experience in dealing with civil rights issues in this state, elsewhere. And then to his right, Victoria Lopez, an attorney and director of program and strategy for ACLU of Arizona. So
Thank you.
three key players here in dealing with the Prop 314 and Trump's immigration. Brought to you by Chicanos por la Causa Action Fund. So we'll just kind of get right into it. First of all, well, let's talk about where we are, because let's talk about 314, which is kind of a separate little offshoot, if you will. And 314, is that something that is going to happen, or is this something that trumps the feds, trump anything statewide, that maybe 314 isn't even a player in this? What do you see, and what is CPLC doing?
Yeah, no, Joe, there's a couple pieces to that. There is a piece that after certification does go into effect. And then there is a piece that has to wait until, and I believe, and you jump in, team, here, and correct me, but there's a piece where there needs to be a similar law like the Texas one that needs to pass for it to go into effect. And so it's kind of a two-part thing where one piece does go into effect upon certification, and then the other piece a little bit later on.
Yeah, Arizona's dependent on it, and it's mirrored after the SB4
SB
in Texas,
SB4,
which is
correct.
being heard in the, I think it's the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals.
That's right.
Why is Arizona under the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals when they're in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals? Usually, it's kind of another argument, I think. There's all kinds of arguments, but Arizona's law could not take effect, even though voters approved it, until I believe it's 60 days after it would go into effect in, say, Texas. And right now, the Department of Justice is combating that, but they may drop that appeal, which could accelerate perhaps the law taking effect.
There's a
in
couple
Texas.
of other ones out there. I think Oklahoma
That's right. And
Um,
Iowa.
and Iowa, and so
In
those
Iowa.
could also trigger the law here
Yeah.
going into effect.
And so really we're talking, if 314 were to take effect and all these things happen on a accelerated basis, we're still talking perhaps late spring, early summer. Is that kind of what we're looking at? Is that what you hear?
Yeah. I mean, listen, it's hard to say with the courts, right? What we know is that the Iowa law, the Oklahoma law, the Texas law are all caught up in the respective circuit courts of appeal. And then it's hard to predict sort of when those courts are going to make decisions on those particular laws in those states. But you're right that there is this what's called a trigger provision in Proposition 314 that until those laws go into effect and are in effect for 60 days, then Proposition 314 doesn't take effect, at least with respect to the what's called the illegal entry provision of Proposition 314. As Marco pointed out rightly, there are other provisions of Proposition 314 that can take effect after certification of the Arizona elections on November 25th. It's important also to remember, right, that Proposition 314 started as HCR 2060 in this session of the state legislature, right? And so HCR 2060, which was opposed vocally by our organizations, by many others, including law enforcement, business leaders across the state, which was a direct ballot referral by the Arizona legislature to put Proposition 314 on the ballot, on the November 2024 ballot for Arizona voters. And so, I think really taking a step back and like the origins of Proposition 314 with HCR 2060 really sort of points again to a long history in Arizona of, unfortunately, anti-immigrant proposals starting at the state legislature and moving their way, whether it is through the state legislature or in this case, where we saw lawmakers putting this question directly on the ballot. And it's hard to ignore that there was a very specific political motivation for putting Proposition 314 on the ballot this year. But we also know that, again, unfortunately, there has been a legacy of these types of proposals in Arizona law. And part of those proposals, right, is a direct attack on the federal government's authority under the Constitution to enforce immigration laws and border issues. And so part of Proposition 314, as we have seen previously with laws like SB 1070, is an attempt by Arizona lawmakers, certain Arizona lawmakers, of course, to challenge the federal government's authority to enforce immigration. And one of the ugly byproducts of that, of course, has been to create a racist, hateful, xenophobic environment in the state, and has had real serious community consequences as well as economic consequences and political consequences for our state.
I think the kicker is the use of local law enforcement to assist in the deportation process, along with the courts, not it's
Right.
just law
Yeah.
enforcement. And I think that one of our biggest arguments against the this law or proposed law was that it was an unfunded mandate. Literally, at the end of the day, the question is who's supposed to enforce immigration laws? And of course, the case law that grew out of SB 1070 was that's federal jurisdiction.
Right.
The states have no business in it. Well, they're back again, and they're back again with 314 to allow local law enforcement to help round up, to jail, to deport folks who are here without documents. And so we're back to where we started with SB 1070. The distinction, though, between 1070 and 314 is that it was Governor Brewer and the Republican legislature that enacted SB 1070. Here, as explained earlier, it was run through the proposition process where the voters actually voted in favor of this. The voters in Arizona and the politics in Arizona have always been in favor of anti-immigrant legislation, either through the process of government or through initiative. So it's nothing new. The continued fight against hate is the way I frame this argument. Hate against folks who simply are wanting to do better for themselves and their families, immigrants who are coming from different countries, primarily here in Arizona from Mexico, to feed their families and ultimately make a difference, a positive difference to what we're all about, both as a state and our economy. And so it's disappointing. I can talk about the legal aspects all day, but I want everybody not to lose sight of the human sacrifice that people are going to undergo as a result of these draconian laws that they're trying to pass throughout the country. Right now, the only thing in our favor, there's only one thing, and that is the Supreme Court having stated under SB 1070 that the jurisdiction and or the enforcement of immigration laws is in the jurisdiction of the federal government. But we ought not forget that that was a 5-4 decision.
Yes.
And that we now have more of the 4s than we have the 5s in the Supreme Court. And so,
And it's dangerous territory. The courts in general have become really dangerous territory for civil rights and civil liberties in this country, right? And I think, we have a very different legal landscape than we saw with SB 1070, however many years ago that was now. But
I think if you say elections have consequences, people have to see the broad picture here.
Mhm.
Who gets appointed to the courts? What legislation is passed? I mean, all of these things have consequences. And so unfortunately, in the last 20 years, the political spectrum has shifted to the right, which was, unfortunate because we thought we were making advances. And the
Mhm.
bottom line is that they were quietly sitting in the background, waiting for their turn to come again. Those who have been in power in this country for a very, very long time. And when you take history and the beginning of what was the United States of America to today, this has all happened recently and in very short time. We have had other times. Operation Wetback, was the precursor to what we may see here. We've at least gotten rid of, names like wetback, but now we're always dealing with the word illegal, right? And whatever that means. And so the racism, the hate, uh, call it whatever you want, is what we're up against and what we've been fighting and will continue to fight.
Yeah, I think, yes, real quick on talking about, 314 is also the sales job that was done on 314, calling it the Secure the Border Act. And, it couldn't go through the legislature and the governor because it was blocked. So then it went the political route among party lines, strictly party lines, to put it on the ballot, but using that as fighting against illegal smuggling of fentanyl across the border.
Right.
Well, who isn't against that? We all are.
Right.
Everyone is. But there is so much more in this act.
Yeah.
I mean, everything in the kitchen sink is in there. And initially on there, Dreamers DACA recipients were mentioned by name. So the target is big and wide. It isn't a matter of local law enforcement agents hiding behind a rock at the border to nab
Right.
fentanyl smuggling. So it was the way it was presented was one thing when it's actually an entirely different.
And we've seen, right, like that's such an important point because in this Proposition 314, we just saw this conflation of issues, right? So included in there are the fentanyl provisions, right? And increasing penalties for people who sell fentanyl, bring fentanyl across the border. It also includes provisions that criminalize folks who are seeking public benefits, folks who are seeking employment. And in those two instances, in those two sections of Proposition 314, we already know there are federal and state laws that address the question of people fraudulently seeking public benefits or fraudulently seeking employment. And so it begs the question, right? Like, what is the purpose of Proposition 314? And it's hard to ignore that in many ways, it really is to drive and stoke a narrative around criminalization of immigrants, communities of color, and when in fact there are already laws on the books that address many of those issues that Proposition 314 claims to address. We saw that, as you say, like the broad scope of these kinds of things impacts businesses, impacts people who are seeking employment, impacts people who are trying to get their kids enrolled in school. All of those communities are going to be impacted by the nuts and bolts of Proposition 314, but also by the narrative and the rhetoric that is behind laws like Proposition 314, and we've seen that previously.
Yeah, and it's also, we know from the SB 1070 days that driving while Mexican was a perfectly good reason to pull people over. I mean, how do you look at a suspected undocumented immigrant? It's usually by the color of their skin. Or the community they live in.
Yeah, I think that when we deal on jurisdictional issues with the state versus federal, the other is how local law enforcement is going to enforce this. And we've said it over and over again, and we said it during SB 1070, it's only going to lead to greater racial profiling of the Latino community. There was, in fact, a study done on SB 1070, and this was, I think, a good 7-8 years ago, in which, and I'm giving you the rough numbers, in which 6,000 people, okay, were detained where police officers stopped them for running a red light or speeding, et cetera, and then ultimately reported to ICE. In this situation, they couldn't hold them or do anything with them. What we have currently, they will be able to hold them. So I want to make that distinction. But with SB 1070, the Supreme Court said, look, you can detain somebody if you suspect for one reason or another. Language can't be it, color can't be it. We know differently. You can hold them, but you can't hold them beyond a reasonable amount of time for ICE to show up to take them away, to continue the detention and ultimate arrest. of the 6,000 that ICE did that with, 40% of them were released. 40% never should have even been detained. And so I think that if you see the effect of SB 1070 and the limited authority that the Supreme Court gave local law enforcement, this is just going to set the world on fire in terms of racial profiling.
And SB 1070, for those unfamiliar with, because that was 14 years ago. We've had a million people moved here since then. They don't know, or they were too young, so they don't know the "show me your papers" law, is what it's referred to. So when they say, well, it's just like SB 1070, many people are like, I don't know what that was. So they don't fully understand. And like when they voted perhaps in favor of this, they didn't fully understand what they were voting for either. They were voting against fentanyl smuggling, and secure the border, okay, fine, but all this other impact. And you mentioned law enforcement and the abuse of civil rights. We know what happened with Sheriff Joe Arpaio. We know the courts coming down, and we know the violation and contempt of court by Sheriff Joe Arpaio. We know the amount of money that it costs just through the federal monitoring that has taken place. We're talking about more than $300 million since then. There is a cost to these abuses, but yet in 314 there's an immunity clause in there. So they know there's going to be abuse by police. So they put an immunity clause in there. So anybody says, oh, there won't be any abuse, then why did you have an immunity clause?
Right.
And that's coupled with the piece on probable cause, right? And that's the broad piece there, that they can, with probable cause, stop and ask and do what they're going to do, but then they have immunity. And so it's coupled with that to kind of piece that together. So because they know, and I agree with you, Joe, they know that abuses are going to be there. And so on the front end of it, they're trying to mitigate that for law enforcement.
I think, Joe, the other distinction that needs to be made here is that we've got civil and criminal impact here. Look, there isn't anybody out there that's going to say they're for fentanyl, right? And that was the problem with what the voters had to vote for. They were yes for controlling fentanyl, regulating, right? And mine was yes on the fentanyl and no on the immigration side of it, right? And at the end of the day, the court said the one subject rule wasn't violated here. But remember, we're not chasing after the issue surrounding fentanyl, at least from my standpoint. We're going after the civil aspect of this and its impact on our community.
Yeah, and the Cato Institute did the study, of course, and the report was on fentanyl. Smuggling by undocumented immigrants is such a small percentage of the arrests that were made for fentanyl across the border. It was Americans who were smuggling across the border fentanyl. So even when the facts get out there, it's a red herring. We can call it a brown herring if you want, but it was very much targeting for a community. And this is the part that I think people don't fully understand, is that when you talk about immigration issues to the Latino community, it is a personal issue. It is friends, families, neighbors, coworkers. They are part of our community. To many in the non-Latino community, it's a political rhetoric. It's like, I don't like Latinos. I think they're taking over too much. They're getting too much. It's just kind of a very nationalist, racial-based decision that has no really impact on their lives, that they think doesn't have impact on their lives. But there will be impact, because immigrant labor is a success story in this country on many levels, including contributions to our economic force and our supply chain and our workforce. And I think that those who were looking to vote for lower prices at the grocery store or what have you are going to be surprised at the economic impact it has if you have this chilling effect and actual effect of deportations against our immigrant population.
Yeah.
Well, I think getting back to informing the public about what's going on, there will be challenges. Yes, 314. It is our hope that based upon the precedent set by SB 1070 that it will be enjoined. And always it's a matter of what judge gets the case, because there's a kind of a random selection of judges. I'm confident that in this situation, precedent will be in our favor. I'm not saying it's not possible, but I think that there's a good chance that it will be enjoined, the civil aspects of it. And then, of course, we go next to the Ninth Circuit, which, once again, I have a positive view of them, even though it's gotten a little bit more conservative over time. I have a positive view, and I think it's going to end up in the Supreme Court. I don't buy this SB4 business. I mean, the Ninth Circuit is different from the Sixth, okay? And at the end of the day, what they put in the legislation, the Supreme Court is not bound by in terms of when it'll take effect. And to me, I can't say it will, I can't say it won't, but I don't want to tell people, with SB4, if it's declared constitutional, we're done. Not my position at all. I think that we continue to follow the route.
Let's talk about the larger umbrella of the Trump deportation plans, and mass deportation is what we keep hearing, and that was the promise, and that seems like to be the plan, which many people saying, well, don't worry about 314. In fact, Senate President for Arizona, Warren Peterson, was saying, 314 probably won't even need to take effect because Trump's immigration is going to be the big thing. Now, ACLU is challenging that because it's like, we don't have any information on this. What is the information? So can you talk a little bit about that challenge and where we are on the
Yeah, I mean, my
deportation?
my colleagues at the National ACLU have done a series of like FOIA requests over the last few months to gather information about the capacity of the Department of Homeland Security and ICE and Customs and Border Protection specifically around their detention and deportation operations to fully understand sort of where we are in current moment and what are the possibilities for a ramp up? What does that look like under a second Trump administration? And listen, like we already had a first Trump administration, right? So we know what that playbook looks like to a certain extent. And so it is partly trying to get a better sense, a handle on like where there might be potential for detention expansion, for example, where there might be potential for digging into what are called cooperative agreements between federal and local law enforcement. And all of these things are already in law, right? These are not things that are just have emerged because of Trump, but it is figuring out like how will the Trump administration utilize these tools to enact what they are calling a mass deportation plan, right? I think we saw in the first Trump administration a number of legal challenges by the ACLU and many other organizations across the country to try to stop family separations at the border, to stop obstruction of the asylum system. We saw, a number, and I don't anticipate that will be different this time around. I mean, given what we know about the planning of the Trump administration, litigation will come. I think, the big question for us in Arizona is how do we get a handle on what is happening locally? There is a massive detention and deportation system already in Arizona. Right. And so how do we get a handle on what is happening in Arizona and how the federal government may impose its new policies and its new programs in a place like Arizona? And what can we as Arizonans do to hold both our state and our federal governments accountable for something like a mass deportation program?
I think that when you look at capacity, it is unrealistic to think that the federal government is going to spend the billions. I mean, I heard a number the other day. It was just astronomical.
Yeah.
The billions of dollars to do what he proposes. But this is my prediction. They have already handpicked at least 100,000 people who were potentially due for deportation. Okay.
Anyway, right?
Anyway.
Yeah.
And do a theater.
Yeah.
It's about theater. And they're going to figure out a way to put the cameras on folks being sent back. All right. Whether that's 10,000, 20,000, or whatever number it is, it's going to be front news. It's going to be fulfilling his promise of mass deportations. The reality is that if you go back to 1996, there were 88 million folks who are here undocumented that were eligible for some form of relief if federal legislation is passed. 8 million. Okay. Those
8
folks
million.
8 million. Those folks are still here. We're talking now, over 30 years.
Yeah.
All right. There has been an increase of the number of people who are here, who came here without documentation. And so even if you took a number like 12 million, they put it at 100 million. I mean, that's just inflammatory. And I'm being inflammatory too. But they put at much larger numbers. Is this real? Is this just instilling fear or
No.
hoping that people will self-deport?
Right.
But in terms of capacity, the federal government and state and local governments don't have the capacity to do what they've been promising. And that is the hope, right, that we have beyond the courts and beyond legislation where people are protected. It's unfortunate that Arizona is not one of them. And so I tell communities, look, I mean, there's a lot of speeders out there, but the cops can't catch them all.
Yeah.
Okay.
But the courts are playing. The
There's a lot
courts.
of people running red lights.
I mean, there's
they
like
can't
the,
catch 'em all.
there's like the logistical
Yeah.
improbability that we're talking about here, right? And I mean, we saw this. I mean, right? Like we want to talk about the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office and the litigation, the Melendrez litigation against Maricopa County Sheriff's Office has been going on for a long time now. And we saw this, to your point, of like the logistical improbability, but the front page headlines and
Yes,
the
that's
very
right.
real impact that blocking off an entire community in Guadalupe and having MCSO officers pull people over for busted taillights and arresting them and then them ending up deported, right? Like that impact is very real. And it, even with the logistical improbability or unlikelihood of a mass deportation happening. And I think the question is like, how do we utilize the courts? How do we utilize our systems? How do we engage and get people right on board with the fact that like this is still not okay, right? Even if they can't make good, even if we're not talking about millions and millions of people, mass deportations because it's improbable to happen logistically, like we have to see people standing up and saying like, no, this is unacceptable, right?
Yeah, the battleground is in the communities, but it is in the courts, which are so important. And there's so many groups out there that really don't have the voice, that are depending on civil rights groups and Latino groups to play a part in this. CPLC is one of those groups. I know we've been working with MALDEF, which is the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund, at some avenues, legal avenues. Do you want to talk about some avenues and the importance that courts play a role in this? So it isn't just us against law enforcement, if you will.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and we're working really on two fronts, right? It's that legal side, like Danny said, right? We're make the efforts, and ACLU is making the efforts to challenge from a legal perspective, and hoping and ideally, that precedent that is there, and what we've seen before is what's going to continue. But we have to press, we have to push, we have to stand up, we have to do those things. But on the other end, especially on CPLC side, right? We work with the community. We have our programming. We're there. We came from that, and so working towards making sure that we also inform people, being out there in the community to say, hey, look, here's what's going on, or hey, here's your rights, right? Here's what this means, and informing them too, because that fear that you're talking about and that we're bringing up is real. It's real, and it affects our communities in a lot of different ways. And so if we're able to get out there, that's the other piece that we're really working hard to make sure that we're in the community informing people and giving them as much information.
I think what's important to point out too is that even though we were successful, through organizations like MALDEF or the ACLU, to enjoin the enforcement, Donald Trump still has the federal jurisdiction to do exactly what he's talking about. So, I mean, let's not mix apples and oranges here. I mean, at the end of the day, the federal government's it's the argument I'm using that it's within the jurisdiction of the federal government, right? To do these deportations.
And we've seen that take effect. I
Yeah.
mean, right, like there is authority, for example, for people who have existing orders of deportation, right? There is a system for ICE and federal law enforcement to arrest people who have outstanding orders of deportation. We have seen worksite raids, right? We have seen the enforcement actions, not just at the state level here in Arizona, but at the federal level, right? Over many, many years in different administrations, right? And they have, as I said, they have the legal tools available to them to enforce parts of the immigration law as they will. And to your point, right? Like it is really then necessary to make sure that the information that is being provided to community members, there is also, right, if there is a legal avenue for people to stay or to challenge their deportation in the courts or to challenge more broadly the impact through civil litigation, the impact of any particular law, that folks are informed of what those avenues might be as well in the courts, right? Because
Absolutely.
there are avenues available in the courts, even as dire as it sometimes may seem.
What I've told people is that you can't worry about what you don't know, and you can't worry about what may happen. At the end of the day, you still may be here 4 years from now, and he is not. Okay, and you can use the process, right? If you have equities in which are big in immigration law practice, if you have the amount of time you've been here, the number of children you have, I mean, there's all kinds of possibilities for you to use the process to let 4 years go by, and that's the bottom line. So that's another issue that I've been discussing with people that's very important.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree because, fear was used to get a lot of this passed and in this election results. But our communities should not use the fear and unknowing to somehow affect their daily lives. So they
Or
live
make it easy on
or
him.
make it
Yes.
easy on them, right? So
Right.
so they need to resist this because many of our families in our community are mixed status families too. I mean, it's not like a separation of here are the undocumented and here are the documented. And almost all of the Latino children were born here in Arizona and across the country. So, we're not talking about a young immigrant population here, mixed status families. I mean, so it is a very personal thing. So it is a matter of, how do we protect the communities with knowledge? And that's what we're trying to do through some of our seminars and so forth, through the courts, which is very important as well, and also through a public dialogue, so the public understands what the issues are, because for many of the members of the public who they think, well, we have too many undocumented immigrants here. Well, I invite you to find any industry that doesn't rely on immigrant labor, including
The draw.
college educated immigrants into our country too. So,
Absolutely.
this whole stereotype of what you think are immigrants is just it's wrong. It's wrong. And this country relies on immigrant labor and immigrant future and success stories. We only hear the negative, dehumanizing stories and narrative, and why there hasn't been greater pushback on this prevailing narrative is beyond me, because it's the success of immigrant stories in this country still today that we don't hear about. We're not shown.
Yeah. Well, that's why it was so critically important for them to attach the fentanyl provision to Proposition 314, right? Because we've seen over decades now, right, an increase of conflating immigration and safety and security, right? And right, not a very nuanced approach or perspective on the border, right? And what happens at the border and sort of all of the things that happen at the border, whether that is commerce passing through ports of entry, people passing through ports of entry, asylum seekers, and what is happening at the border. And without having a more nuanced understanding and view of what happens at the border, it makes it easier for, I think, lawmakers and I think for the public to conflate and fall into that narrative of immigration or border issues being about security and safety. And then it then leads to the criminalization of migrants and communities of color. I'm being very simple here. It's much more nuanced, of course, but I do think that, right, that is why we saw Proposition 314 set up in the way that we saw it, is because we saw the debate happen at the Arizona State Legislature with law enforcement, right? And we saw this with SB 1070 too. There were amicus briefs filed at the Supreme Court from law enforcement agencies in the state of Arizona saying that they were opposed to these kinds of bills, these kinds of laws. And we saw it vetoed by the governor. We saw HCR 2060 vetoed by Governor Hobbs this session. And so I think it does take all of us to take a step back also with the narrative, but also like the very real specific provisions of law that are included in things like Proposition 314 that merge these two questions of safety, security, and immigration together, and really interrogating and questioning whether that really makes sense for us as a community in Arizona, and then certainly from the legal perspective, like how do you navigate all of these competing provisions of this law? What can you challenge? What can't you challenge? What shouldn't you challenge? Right?
Yeah, and I think what's important here too is that this country, of course, is built on the backs of immigrants, and what, and particularly the Mexican immigrants or those coming from south of the border immigrants, are facing the same challenges that every immigrant group has ever faced. I mean, the Italians, okay,
Yeah, it's almost a hazing
yeah,
process.
yeah, the Italians, the Germans, the Polacks, and you can go on and on as great as we've seen or we talk about this country it has been immigrants who have made it what it is, number one. And number two, when they say but they did it the legal way, there was no way. They came, I mean, all they had to do was
That's
show
right.
up and
That's right.
pass a TB test, right? To get in. But even when they were coming in legally, they were confined to their communities. The racism against them was as deep as it is now against Mexicans. And I think the biggest example are the Italians of most recent time, and the Polish and the Germans. I mean, you can look at the history of this country and what's happening today to go back a couple hundred years. So don't feel like you're exclusive. Okay, Mexicans, don't feel like you're the only ones that got picked on here. But you have the likes of organizations, and you have the likes of lawyers who serve the public, who are going to defend your rights. You do have rights, no matter how badly people feel about you. And you can write this process, and you can be here. And I'll reiterate, he will be gone before anything happens to you.
And that's why it's so important, to that point, that we focus also on the resources, right? Because if we're going to allow, and hopefully, Danny, I'm with you. You're going to be here. He's not, right? But we have to let and have people have the availability to the resources so that they can write it out, whether it's through the system or whatever it is, get them to that point so that they're still here when he's not.
We have to give people hope.
Yeah. Well, I thank you, and I agree with you on that. Like I said, it's a hazing process, but it seems like for many Latinos, this is the second iteration of hazing. We have to go through it twice, maybe. That's fine. But right. But the main thing is for the community to know you have voices, you have resources, and you have forces behind you that are going to push against this, whether it be a legal avenue or otherwise, that you're not alone. And so don't feel alone. Don't give up hope, and understand that we're in for the fight, because we know for the immigrant community, we are not rapists, murderers, drug dealers, and we're not going to eat your dog and cat. We know who we are. We know the work that we put in to make this a great country for a better life for all, including other Americans. So it isn't just about the immigrant population. It's about what immigrants provide for our nation. And so a very worthwhile American dream is what it's about. So don't lose sight of that fact. Thank you all for participating today. And like you said, Danny, don't give up hope. Thank you. I'm Joe Garcia, and we'll talk to you next time.